Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our Census 2020 webinar. We want to thank CAPAC, Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, for hosting us on this for this really important topic. I am Terry Almenis, Senior Director of Census and Voting Programs for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and I am joined by my great colleague and friend, Christine Chen, Executive Director from Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. And today we're going to walk through how to best prepare the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities for the 2020 census, including reviewing what's currently being done in the community to prepare, learn about gaps that exist between 2010 census as to today, and then review some findings from messaging research and what type of supplemental materials are being translated. Next slide, please. Next slide. So to start off, just wanted to let you all know about some census websites where you can find more information and resources. First is the Census Bureau's website, www.2020census.gov. There is another website that Asian Americans Advancing Justice is hosting for a lot of the AANHPI materials. And this is done across the Advancing Justice affiliation, and that is www.countusin2020.org. And then finally, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights also has a census campaign, Census Count, and you can find a lot of information, including our information, but also information from other partner organizations at www.censuscounts.org. Next slide, please. One more. So just, I know you all are familiar with this, but just a little base setting. We know that the census is taken every 10 years and is mandated by the Constitution for the purposes of reapportionment and assigning the congressional seats to the states, but then also census data are used in the redistricting process to redraw these legislative boundaries to make sure it's responsive to population change. And finally, census data are also used to inform federal funding in a report that was just released yesterday from George Washington University, has found now that census data guides $1.5 trillion in federal funding every year to the states. Next slide, please. Again, just a reminder that being counted in the census helps families, right? That the $1.5 trillion is not just a very large number, which it is, but that it really goes down, trickles down to the state level, the services that our families need to both not just function, but also to thrive. Next slide, please. Census is also very important for political representation, not only the reapportionment and redistricting that I mentioned previously, but it's also critical to get this fair and accurate census count to help protect voters against discrimination, voting discrimination based on race, as well as to help ensure that jurisdictions are providing language assistance to voters. Next slide, please. On the reapportionment front, just wanted to flag that if we have a fair and accurate count, looking at how the population has been changing over the decade, we see a possible shift for congressional seats from the Midwest and the Northeast to the South and the West. Next slide, please. And again, redistricting will rely on census data and also will be really critical for not only drawing equal populous districts, but also making sure that we're able to enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Next slide, please. And again, we need to remember that census benefits everybody living in the United States and every community. It is why the census has historically been a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue that everybody has gotten behind because of the impact it has on each and every one of us living in this country. And so definitely a good reminder for us to, as we're trying to work with everybody and certainly working across the aisle to, keep this in mind that having an accurate count really only serves to benefit each and every one of us. Next slide, please. Certainly for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, a fair and accurate census count is really critical for helping us understand the needs of our community. Census is the census, including the American Community Survey and other surveys, really is the most comprehensive set of socioeconomic data on our communities, disaggregated or broken out for our different communities. So critical when we're trying to both dispel stereotypes about our communities being not only monolithic, but also being highly successful and not facing any challenges or issues, but also really important for us to be able to understand where gaps are, where problems are happening, so that we can properly plan our work and understanding how to effectively and efficiently utilize what limited resources we may have. And certainly for organizations such as ours, you know, critical for being able to write grants, for example, or even conduct advocacy with policymakers. Next slide, please. So important for us to remember that the census literally is right around the corner, right? In January, the census will officially start with the enumeration of some remote communities, starting off in January in Alaska. Even though we know that the majority of people in the country will start seeing postcards being sent to most of the homes in March, non-response follow-up happening in May and July. So between March and May, a lot of the self-response activity will be happening. And then, of course, at the end of the year, the Census Bureau Director will deliver the apportionment count to the President, who will then, you know, make that announcement. These are some important time frames to think about, because these are likely when your offices will get calls and questions from people about sort of what's going on, what's happening. So just, you know, good to keep in mind resources that are available, whether it's from our website, from the Census Bureau, or other community partners. Next slide, please. And finally, just a little bit more detailed about when and how the Census Bureau will invite people to respond. And so again, just take a look at these dates and kind of let your different offices know that there might be some questions that start coming in from constituents, and, you know, to be prepared to respond to them. Next slide, please. The first method is that people will fill out their census form online. This is the first time that it'll be available for the public as actually the preferred way for the Census Bureau for people to participate. People will also be able to actually fill out their census form on over the phone, talking to somebody at the telephone questionnaire assistance lines. Previously, people could call into the telephone lines, but they couldn't actually fill in their form, couldn't give them answers or responses. So that'll be a first as well. This time around, there will actually be 12 non-English language options for the online form and for the telephone questionnaire, and there'll be 59 non-English language assistance materials, so things like ID cards, a language assistance guide, glossaries, and the like. An important thing to note is the paper form will only be available in English and Spanish, whereas previously there had been other in-language paper forms. And that this time around, there is no Native American and there's no Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander language assistance options for the form. So that is, there's no form that they could fill out in these languages, as well as there's no actual language assistance materials, no language assistance guides, and the like. Advancing Justice AAJC is working with the community to develop some language assistance guides in 6 Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander languages, and we'll be sure to share that as those materials get produced. Next slide. Other differences about the 2020 census is that there will be a question on the form asking other people in the house of their relation to person 1 on the form, and will include a same-sex relationship option, response option. This time around, the Census Bureau will not be funding questionnaire assistance centers, and then meaning that that it'll be on community-based organizations to host them if they choose to. Rather, the Census Bureau is actually pursuing a mobile response initiative. Recruitment for census takers and other staffing positions will only be online also different from before. And finally, the footprint in the field will also be significantly less, with about half the number of local area offices as they had before, which in the 2010, there was a area office in every congressional district. This time it will only be half of the congressional districts will have a local area office, and the field staff will also be cut in half as compared to 2010. Next 2 slides, please. So I'm going to walk through some of the Count Us in 2020 resources that are available for you. Again, our website is www.countusin2020.org. Next slide. And on this website, you can find information like webinars, blogs, fact sheets, toolkits, and the like. We will also be providing for community members infographics, social media events, public service announcements, and some swag, if you will, for people to be able to utilize at their Get Out the Count events and activities. Next slide. The next slide just shows sort of the process we went through in creating much of our community education materials. It was definitely a co-creation with our state partners and the other Advancing Justice affiliates. Next slide, please. So what we worked with, part of what we discovered or decided when we worked in co-creating with our state partners is the fact that we wanted to make sure that the fact sheets we created were things that were customizable for our partners. We recognize that for many of the community members, the local trusted messenger is the community group or the identity that they will actually recognize and have their trust in. So we have the ability for people to utilize our fact sheets and actually add their local logo and or contact information there. The other piece that was really critical that we heard from our state partners was that in producing and translating materials, that it was really critical to have a community check both on the English text before it went to translation, as well as the actual a community check on the translation itself to make sure that it resonated properly with the community. Next slide. So again, just a listing of some of the materials that we have. Next slide. So here we have a list of our webinars, and I'm just gonna, won't read them all to you, but I'll just note some of the different pieces that we have are things like census FAQs. We have a webinar on digital tools, as well as a, that includes the hard to count map some of you may have seen, but it was really an effort to try to go step by step as to how to use the hard to count maps to really inform a effort to do outreach in the community. We had webinars around the citizenship question once the Supreme Court decision came out. More recent webinars included organizing and confidentiality, as well as engaging college students. Our next webinar that is coming up will be around K through 12, as well as younger children, as well as many of you may know, the undercount of young children, that is those under 5, are really among the highest of all groups. Next slide, please. Here I'm going to run through the fact sheets that we that we'll be producing. We have a 2020 census timeline. We have a fact sheet on what the 2020 census asked me. How do I respond? A Census 101 that is really focused for community members, and then we have a Census Outreach 101 that's really focused more for community leaders and CBOs to really kind of help them figure out what they can do to help get out the count. We have a fact sheet on how the 2020 census affects your community, how to count young family and young children, how to engage your friends and family. We have a fact sheet on language resources and how to get assistance. We do have a fact sheet on census confidentiality and the citizenship question, as we know that's something that has been very pressing on many people's minds. Finally, we have 2 more fact sheets, one around the internet response option in the 2020 census and how to identify a census taker. Next slide, please. The next 2 slides actually just kind of outline what the Census Bureau's plans are around language support. So you can actually run through those, Christine. If you can go to the Count Us in 2020 translations, these are the materials that I had listed above. around get out the count fact sheets, whatnot, will be supported in these 23 Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander languages. I will note that Advancing Justice AAJC is working in partnership with EPIC, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, to develop a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander specific campaign. I know Christine will talk a little bit, we'll talk more about it in a little bit, but I do want to flag that the translations that are being conducted processed through this process is actually being run out of EPIC. And through the community itself. Okay, next couple of slides, I can run through quickly, Christine, just to go through some of the messaging. So the messaging deep dive, we do have a webinar, a messaging deep dive webinar, and I do invite you all to check that out if you'd like to learn more about the messaging research that we've done and where we've landed. There's a link to the webinar on this slide. The research project that we had both in-person focus groups as well as an online survey component to it. If you can go to slide 32, Christine, just some highlights as to what the research found. It was important for us to know that a majority, that is 55% of those surveyed, had not heard anything about the upcoming 2020 census. Now, this was done back in 2018. It is likely that hopefully the number is a little bit higher about people who have heard about the census, but I will note that the findings from our research really mirror what the Census Bureau found in their CBAM's research, and that is from the Census Bureau themselves. They found that Asian Americans were the least likely to participate in the census. Next slide, Christina, slide 33. So also of importance for us to realize is that less than half of those surveyed actually knew that everybody was supposed to participate in the U.S. Census. That is, more than 50% thought only citizens were supposed to fill out the census. That's highly problematic generally, but also when you consider that our community is made up of, over 90% of our community are either immigrant or children of immigrants. So this is really problematic to have this out there as a falsehood that people believe in. Next slide, please. We also saw that nearly half of those surveyed were concerned about the addition of the citizenship question when that was an issue, which really, even though we won on that issue, it still indicates there's a potential serious impact on participation because it's not clear that everyone understands that we won. And then there's ongoing conversations with respect to the executive order that the president had issued after capitulating on the citizenship question issue. All right, next slide. So here I just wanted to share some of the top messages that worked from those that we tested. The top messages were really around family, especially when it was a statement around family with a focus on children. And so I think that's something that not necessarily surprising, but good to have that reaffirmed, that that's something that that still resonates with people. Next slide, please. Also important to note that those surveys said that they were most likely to complete the census form using either the online option or returning the paper form. This is interesting since there is a telephone option, and that is a way that people can provide, can get in language assistance. And so it's interesting that people were not, that keen on utilizing the phone to provide their responses. And of course, there was very little interest in providing them in person to a enumerator or census taker that came to your house during non-response follow-up. So also an opportunity, I think, for us to message around that about trying, to make sure that people respond early and for themselves. Next slide, please. And then finally, more than 1 in 3 of the survey gave a great deal of attention to friends and family as a source of information about the census. So again, I think not necessarily surprising, but we should urge everyone to, learn more about it, and then also to have conversations with their families and friends about the importance of us all participating in the census. And then one more slide, Christine, and then I'll turn it back over to you. Just some of the key takeaways from the messaging research that we had was, one, We know we need to raise awareness of the 2020 census, including who should be participating, that is everybody. We know we need to address the concern about the citizenship question and really the concerns that have been raised around confidentiality and sort of what protections people have in place. We should remember that there's a preference for a paper form and the online option with how people would like to respond. And the top messages evoke use of family and resources. Although, you know, depending on what region you're in, those messages might change slightly, and certainly depending on which communities, those messages change slightly too. And I would urge you to check out the Messaging Deep Dive webinar if you'd like to learn more about the specifics for different communities. Finally, one thing that did come out in our messaging research is that there was a preference for diversity in advertising. So that is, rather than having one family, you know, just one family of one community by themselves in a messaging platform, the people sort of wanted to see themselves as part of the larger community. So whether that could be like a block party or something like that, where they didn't feel like they were necessarily singled out, and then really again felt like they were a part of community. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Christine.
Great, thank you, Terry. For those of you who have just joined us, that was Terry Alminis from Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC. And also just wanted to flag that this entire PowerPoint will be downloaded and created as a PDF and sent to each and every one of you so you could follow up with many of the resources that we just reviewed. So I'm Christine Chen with Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. And I want to talk a little bit about the observations and some gaps that we've been seeing. And also just to provide a lot of context in terms of all the various competing messages that are going to be out there at the beginning of next year. One thing I really want to emphasize and reflag for everyone is that January through April really is a crazy time period for everyone, because this is when we're trying to get the community to come out to register and participate in the presidential primaries, where that messaging is for those who are 18 years and older and US citizens. Yet at the same time, we need the community to also be outreaching to everyone, telling them that every single person, regardless of status of any sort, in every household, by law is required to participate in the census, and what that actually means to our communities. So this is just a quick calendar in terms of all the things that are happening at the same time for each of the months. So with that in mind, API Vote went ahead and took on an ambitious training schedule, where we went ahead and implemented a 5-hour training for census implementation A to Z from June 2019 through January 2020. This is through our Norman Y. Mineta Leadership Institute, where these regional trainings, we ended up conducting about 40 plus regional trainings. In the morning, we would go ahead and do a recap of preparing for the presidential elections. And then the afternoon, a large bulk of it really was focusing on preparing them for the 2020 census. What we also found was that the majority of everyone that attended the training, this is the first time that they've ever been doing any type of outreach for the census. So they're really newbies, and really was looking to learn a lot about even the basics about what the census would mean, and then to actually talk about figuring out what are the different type of messaging that would work. And then also in these trainings, we would provide an overview of the census and really focusing on what the gaps are, because it really does differentiate from state to state. Because we know what the federal level is doing, but then we know what the gaps are from the federal level. For some states like California, they're providing a lot of more infrastructure, but then other states like Texas, they're providing $0 at the state level. The other thing that we did was also provide a census quiz, and went through a lot of time to go through census scenarios through this. What we found is that a lot of individuals, even though it's 9 questions for every single individual that you're completing this in your household, our lives are a lot more complex. Now, our community and the way we live is no longer black and white. And so a lot of these questions ended up we ended up going through these scenarios and addressing a lot of questions that people would have. Originally, the census quiz only had about 15 to 18 different scenarios, but we ended up adding up to 29 by the end of the tour, just because as we continue to get questions from the community, we would add them onto the census quiz. Our plan is that since this is one of our more popular components of our training, we are looking to put this online so that way individuals can go ahead and take the quiz or use it to train other individuals and volunteers. And then we will also be conducting webinars on the census quiz starting in January as a refresher. So with that, I also want to go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the other census challenges and gaps. A number of them you did hear about that from Terry herself from AJC. But I want to also note that here's one resource that I wanted to flag for you, because there are fact sheets for every single state in terms of how much money was provided to each state. So here is an example in terms of federal programs that were provided funding to Oregon. But this type of example is actually provided, if you look at that link, you could look it up for your particular state and be able to use that in your outreach. As we talked about, I had noted that there is uneven infrastructure within the communities across the country. Like I said, we've been in 40 different cities, and we noted that here in California, you have over $187 million that were allocated at the state level. But then as you go down the line, if you don't see your state listed, that means your state legislature did not allocate any funding for census. So for instance, going back to my example of Texas, at the state level, they did not allocate any dollars, but then on the county level, many times, especially in the Houston, Austin, and Dallas areas, their counties are becoming a lot more active, and the foundations are being more active in terms of trying to allocate funding to do outreach in itself. The other thing I wanted to point out is that census specialists really vary from a region to region. What we found is that, unfortunately, we don't have as many census specialists that have worked in the AANHPI communities that have had experience from 2000 or 2010. Many of the census specialists that we met were attending our training and actually learning quite a bit from our own training. Some areas, like for instance, Washington, Georgia, Santa Clara County, or Northern California, it was great to see that there are API specialists that had not only the relationships, but they're also working with the county and state level and the nonprofit organizations in a concerted effort to actually develop a campaign that's very comprehensive. For example, in Georgia and in Washington State, our nonprofit communities, not only did they create their own AAPI complete count committees, but in Georgia, they even created one for Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese. So they segmented it out, created their own committees. The leaders of that coalition, which is CAPAC and Asian American Advancing Justice Atlanta, they've also taken through trainings as well as helping them create their own plans. They actually have a calendar of what they're planning on doing from now until the summer of 2020. And they're also allocating resources for each of these specific complete count committees. So it was really great to see that. At the same time, unfortunately, many of the locations where we were going to, this is the first time they were hearing about the census. And so there's a lot of work that had to be done in terms of even introducing them to their local census specialists, understanding what a partnership may look like, and getting them started in terms of trying to figure out what their plan may actually look like in itself. With the funding and resources, one thing I want to also note is that the US Census did go ahead and allocate funding and hired contractors to create communications and advertising for Asian American communities, specifically only Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, and Japanese communities and their ethnic press outlets. And then there was also another contractor for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. But with that, we are also noting that even with the Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, Japanese, they're only taking some of the top states that have the larger populations and purchasing ad buys for the census. And in other cases, like South Asian and a number of the Southeast Asian communities, they're not even part of the advertising buy ads for the US Census. API Vote recently just got a grant for over $220,000, where we will be working with our local nonprofit communities and partners to identify where the gaps are within their state. And we're hoping to be able to provide some coverage for those communities in terms of trying to purchase advertising with their ethnic press to make sure that the word gets out in the next few months. Wanted to flag again, like what Terry had noted about the language guides from the US Census. So these language guides are in 59 different languages as a print language guide as well as a video. So here's an example in terms of what the print language guide will look like. And then the video language guide will be about 8 minutes, where they'll provide an introduction to the 2020 census, provide them a quick tour of what that will look like online, what the online form will look like. And this will be a translated guide, video guide, that will last about 6 minutes. My understanding is that it is in English, but they will have subtitles in the various languages. In addition, we also note that even with the Asian American advertising that was being done in those 5 languages, it is, they're not necessarily creating that many videos and PSAs in language. So following the lead of EPIC and Asian American Advancing Justice, we will be commissioning in-language PSAs that will be released by the beginning of January that could be used for basic education and outreach for our communities in language. Also this November, in preparation for Thanksgiving, next week we will be releasing a PSA video that was produced by Facebook and along with our interns this summer to start the conversation about what is the census and how that may impact your own family and friends. And we're encouraging people and individuals to go out to their families and start the conversation over Thanksgiving in itself. Other thing that we are trying to flag is that heading into 2020, we're also are noticing that our communities are no longer just on mainstream social media. We are organizing on WeChats and Kakao. In particularly, there have been some discussions on WeChat among the Chinese community about pushing back in regards to identifying themselves as Chinese and just marking themselves as Asian Americans. So we will be conducting a few experiments in messaging around fact versus myth, around the census, specifically on WeChat, in hopes that the lessons learned from this, we can also apply it to our work in the elections for this November as well. I also wanted to flag that National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, also NCAPA, has a online pledge card. We also have seen APALA and CRAC also create some in-language materials as well, specifically for their constituents. And they're also all available on countusin2020.org. And EPIC, in particularly empowering Pacific Islander communities, they are creating videos and fact sheets in 8 different languages, sorry. And this is just an example in terms of what their materials and what their productions will look like. I believe they're looking to get this done by the end of the year as well. As we end this webinar or this section, I want to also really emphasize with each and every one of you, like, what can each of your districts or the congressional offices can do? Like I said, it is very uneven in terms of the organizing that is being done by state and by region. So here's just some other reminders is that, one, hopefully you have already identified your local census specialist that you can be working with, and also identifying your AANHPI census specialists. To also train your own staff, leadership, and any super volunteers with all the materials that we have provided that will be supplemental to what is being created by the US Census. As noted, we will keep you updated in terms of additional webinars and census quizzes that we may be doing in the upcoming months. Also, in terms of identifying a complete count committee that you can be working with. Just to know, complete count committees don't necessarily have to be a formal infrastructure that's being run by the local government. There are a wide variety of different complete count committees, whether it's by ethnicity or by nonprofit communities. We encourage you to take a look at who is there and available. And if any of you are located in the 40 cities that API Vote did visit, we'll be glad to introduce you to the local coalition of the API community that's working on census. So that way you could coordinate your efforts together. The other thing that we've also asked each of our nonprofit partners to do, and something for you to think about, is when creating a local outreach plan, you know, who's currently missing from the table? What communities have traditionally not, have not been involved with census that we need to bring on board? Are there specific ethnic communities that you're focusing on in your particular regions? What are some barriers that are facing them in particularly for your area? But then more importantly, hopefully all these questions will help you lead into creating the tactics and action items of what your calendar of events and activities need to be done from January through the summer of 2020. With the big lead up of April 1, 2020 being Census Day. I know that especially working in the congressional office, your bosses get invited all the time to so many different events. So you probably have a very comprehensive list of activities and events that are happening in the next 6 months. And it will be really great for you to coordinate with our local partners to ensure that we have proper coverage, and to work with also the local Census Bureau to make sure that we are doing whatever we can to make sure that every event and every community gets touched and understanding about the 2020 census in itself. And then lastly, it is also about identifying resources. Some communities have been fortunate that they have funding from the state or county level or even from local foundations, but then other areas they have not necessarily had access to that. So it's even identifying local businesses who could print outreach materials for them, or even local donors that can go ahead and provide additional funding so that way they could pay for food or different items that are needed to get the attention of the community in itself. So with that, I would like to go ahead and encourage everyone, you could go ahead and unmute yourself by pressing *6. And that way, if you have any questions, we'll be glad to go ahead and answer them. Maggie, I went ahead and unmuted you. If you have a question.
No, sorry, that was an accident.
Oh, okay, no problem. I'll mute you back. Any other questions? You could raise your hand or *6. Or I could unmute everyone if you have any problems. Are there any questions? I just unmuted everyone in case you had any difficulty. Okay, well, seeing that there are no questions.
This is Maggie from Nevada. Right now we're competing with a lot of activity in our state. So just in terms of trying to figure out how to combat like constituent fatigue, because as you know, we have a lot of presidential candidates that are contacting folks on the doors, just a lot of activity here in Nevada. And then also on top of the census, we also are trying to outreach for the caucus, and then as well as you know, trying to ensure that, you know, we do get folks who are going to be receptive to all the census campaigns here, given that there's so much activity. If there's like any, you know, strategies or anything like that that you've heard of that could be helpful, because that's something that I'm concerned with here in this state.
Yes. Be- So I know with the Asian American Advancing Justice AJCs, their messaging results, that they did note that the best for people to actually talk about census are really family and friends. And so even though I know, like in Nevada, ACDC is your main local nonprofit that's building out the capacity and coalition to do that work, anything that your office can do to recruit more volunteers, so that way we could get them trained and get more individuals talking effectively about the census and answering questions, and for us to actually start early on right now, because I know you are competing quite a bit, and luckily because Nevada is also an early state, that hopefully after the caucus is done, then you guys could go in full swing in terms of focusing on the census itself. The other thing that you may also want to do is that, because things are happening, you may just have to be upfront and start talking about, like how API Vote's been doing, is that, look, next year we actually are there are two ways that we need to make sure our communities are being counted. One is through the primaries and the elections for those who are eligible, but then the other one is that where every single household needs to be counted, and to start explaining what the census is. Terry, do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, especially on that last point, Christine, is just also helping people really understand that this is for everybody, right? That that everyone is supposed to participate. And I think, like, I mean, even like a lot of the discussion around voting, you know, part of how we have to engage people and get people interested in voting is not just voting for the sake of voting, but why we vote, and sort of tying it back to the issues that we care about. So again, using things like the state fact sheets that Christine had mentioned from Andrew Reamer and George Washington, that lays out the funding that goes to each state because of census data. On the Count Us in 2020.org website, we also have state fact sheets that pull some of the information that from Andrew Reamer's research, but also have information about the you know, population size for Asian Americans as well as Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders for each state, and the counties where they're most populous, the top 10 counties, I believe, for Asian Americans, for the largest populations, and then also for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders by state. So again, I think as much as you can kind of really contextualize it and make it tangible for people to understand why it's so critical for, you know, for the communities and the families. Ultimately, I think it is really piggybacking and tying it into how it relates to everything else. I think, Christine, certainly one of the things that we found in 2010 when we worked on this together was that efforts to host, for example, a census standalone event were generally not quite as successful as being able to tie into existing events, whether it's, you know, having a table at a local festival, or utilizing these other existing events to really help get the word out.
And that's why I was saying that if all of you can even talk to your schedulers, even if your boss can't attend everything, if they know what all the events are happening in the community, that can really help us create a calendar to make sure there's proper coverage. Also, just start thinking about, even for Thanksgiving or Christmas, I know with our team, we started thinking, like, can we start sending out messages, or maybe have your bosses incorporate in their messaging or their speeches, like, oh, for this Thanksgiving, I'm thankful for X millions of dollars that we received the last 10 years for our education or for the roads, and that's why I'm able to drive back home to visit my family for Thanksgiving. Or, you know, just to think of creative ways of how we incorporate census and how it impacts our lives into what is happening with the Thanksgiving and Christmas season. Other questions? well, hopefully we, seeing that there are no other questions, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. As we said, we will go ahead and email out this PowerPoint and provide contact information for both of us. So that way, if you have any additional questions, we'll be glad to follow up with each and every one of you. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you all.